He wrote a couple extra notes.
Should I use them tonight?
I hereby call this meeting, Norwood City Council, to order. Please rise for the prayer and pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in this council chamber. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we can do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Here.
Mr. Geraci.
Here.
Mr. Kelch.
Here.
Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here.
All members present. Moving on to item E, amendment of agenda.
Request, please.
Mr. DiNardo.
I have a request to amend the agenda, removing L2. This was originally a bit of my request and the law department to try to move something forward, but I'd like to bring up this into new business rather than have the first reading of the ordinance, just to better define and just have a discussion on what the best move forward should be.
Okay, so you'd like to remove
L2, please.
L2, okay. Also, late this afternoon, I put an ordinance on your desk. I received this from Mr. T.A. Brown, Mr. Gary. This is an ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Safety Service into a contract under the Hamilton County Purchase Master Bid Service Program for the purchase of a 2021 Ford F-250 pickup truck and declaring an emergency. So I will make that L2 now. And I think that's all I have. May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to accept a motion to accept both of those changes, please.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to accept the two changes. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch?
Second the motion.
Any discussion? No.
Okay.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson. Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item F, minutes of previous meeting, April 13th, 2021. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Motion to accept the minutes.
Motion by Mr. Braden to accept the minutes. Mr. Geraci.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item H, request to address council. We have 4 this evening. The first one, Pastor Sonny James.
Good evening, Pastor Sonny James, 1830 Hopkins Avenue, Norwood, Ohio. First, let me again extend a heartfelt, warm extension of love to all of the families, not just locally, but around the country, around the globe, that are still struggling with the pandemic. My wife's family, currently keep her in your prayers. She has 4 very close family members that have COVID-19 as I stand before you. So let us all just pray for those that are still dealing with that horrific pandemic. We stand today in somewhat of celebration. Justice is not about just us. Justice is about people and the rights of people to be able to breathe, to be able to live, and be afforded the same opportunities that every person on this earth should have. There are many people of color right now celebrating, even as we mourn the loss of George Floyd, This dates back to 1955 when Emmett Till was murdered. Folks, I don't know if you realize it, but there are 400 people of color that have died at the hand of police officers, and it has gone on far too long. But we thank God for a day of accountability. At the same time, I want to extend heartfelt sorrow for the officers that serve this country, and sometimes many feel like they're darned if they do and darned if they don't. Not everybody is bad. But there's still injustices happening all over. And I'm chuckling inside because I recently received a phone call. And they said, "Is this Pastor Sonny James?" And I said, "Yes, sir, it is." And they told me who they were, and I had to check the phone and knock it and say, "Hello, do you have the right one?" And they said, "Yes, sir. Pastor, we hear that you've been struggling to get the attention of your peers." And I said, "Well, it's not a struggle. They just try to act like I don't exist." And he said, "Well, George Floyd's death is not in vain. There are many people that are being choked out just like you. And we want to help. How can we help you?" And it reminded me just years ago, I was very instrumental in having the Department of Justice come right here to Norwood. Some of you are aware of that. But when we met, my colleagues got together minutes before we began our meeting, and they came up with an idea that we should only focus on the positive. Well, I want you to know that I have been here in this community, and at the hands of many of you sitting before me now, have felt choked out, smothered, unheard. I want to celebrate, though, because I'm so excited that the day of accountability is coming our way. And we have some great individuals here. But I agree with the individual that called me, because as I'll introduce Mr. Kelch to a resident that recently had their life threatened. And I saved their life, and they will tell him so. But all I can get from leadership is, "Okay, we heard about it, but what did you want me to say to you?" Well, how about a thank you? We were coming together to talk about equality and raising up racial issues. Well, that's no longer here nor there. I just want to challenge all of us today, folks. This is a day of celebration, but it's also a time of reconciliation. And it's a time to put down the gauntlet and let us move our fine community forward. I love Norwood. I love my family being here. But just like on May 1st of last year, had an incident in front of my home, the police were called. Why is it that it takes the insurance company to figure out what happened? People should work together. God bless you all. Let's keep praying one for another. Let's keep working together, because the day of accountability is coming to Norwood. God bless you all. Peace.
Thank you, Pastor James. Our next request to address council is Susan Hoover.
Thank you so much. My name is Susan Hoover. I'm at 3827 Spencer Avenue. I'm here to talk about Xavier student housing. For wards 1 and 2, some unruly Xavier housing has been an ongoing issue. I've lived in Ward 2 for 22 years and have seen this issue firsthand. Many of our Xavier students are wonderful additions to our neighborhood. Several years ago, for example, the students on our street would join the kids on our street in water gun battles and toss in the football. However, many properties have become a serious nuisance to the peace and tranquility of our neighborhood. It is common for loud, drunken parties to go on for all hours with little or no concern for the families living around them. For years, scattered and inconsistent efforts were attempted with personal engagement, calls to police, and even contacting Xavier. A meeting was initiated by some community residents and included the Xavier Police Chief, Robert Warfel, Xavier Dean of Students, Jean Griffin, Jim Shelby with the Norwood Health Department, and Norwood Police Chief Kramer about the ongoing issue of this unruly Xavier student housing. We are working to create a comprehensive plan that both improves the relationships with our student residents and increases the enforcement of issues such as littering, loud parties, and public intoxication. As the Xavier school year is coming to a close and most students are moving, working on improving relationships will mostly be addressed in the fall. Community residents at that point will be invited to walk with Xavier staff, to introduce themselves, provide welcome information, and give students information on community standards. Post-COVID, we'll encourage block parties to include students and hope to work with a community-based learning program at Xavier. We have a few plans in terms of enforcement. First, Xavier shared a link where residents can log complaints. It is important to provide as much information as possible, the address, photos, even video, and a description of the issue. You do not need to know or provide the student's information or name. You can find the link at the Xavier Dean of Students office page on the Student Concern Report tab. I did give Maria a copy of the tab. It's a very, very long link that doesn't make any sense, so I hope that she'll be able to put that in the minutes. Chief Kramer also encourages residents to contact the police with any issues, and for the most impact, ask the responding officer to contact you after the call for the outcome and have the option to attend any court hearings that may result. Typically, the first visit by police is a warning. Multiple calls can and should lead to fines. These complaints can be followed up by the property nuisance ordinance as that comes online. The health department can respond to complaints of litter via the See Click Fix app. Jim Shelby typically goes to the residents to make a personal contact and request that the residents picks up the property. After three complaints, the property receives a citation that does require mayor's court. I reached out to Clint Zimmerman with Public Works, and he's looking into having a garbage can and recycling can installed at one of the corners of Clinney and Regent, where there is a hot spot of littering. We are considering this an experiment to see if it works. Also, if you're having issues with speeding residents, you can submit complaints to trafficcomplaints@norwoodpolice.org. Chief Kramer informed me that there are speed signs that can be moved to problem areas. If this effort is something that you're interested in or would like to provide suggestions or input, please reach out to me at Susan_Hoover@yahoo.com or Candace Winterbauer at candace.winterbauer@gmail.com. We'll also be posting this information on social media, and my request to Counsel is that they help spread this information, and if they have additional suggestions, to let Candace or I know. We'll be having a follow-up meeting in July to see how the interventions have worked and to make plans for the fall. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next request to address council is Candace Winterbauer.
Thank you. I'm Candace Winterbauer of 2131 Slane Avenue. Just kind of following up with what Susan said. The meeting, I think, went really well. I'm hopeful that we can continue to make a plan that is sustainable. Just kind of talking to Jean and Susan and some other residents on Regent. There's been things that have been tried to be done in the past about this that haven't worked long term. So Jean Griffin seems very hopeful and really wants to work with us, so I'm excited to see where that will go. I'm also here to let the public know, to let you guys know that Wasson Way is having an informational meeting at Loveland Bike Trail on Saturday, May 1st. Dave Kennedy will be speaking starting around 2 o'clock. He's just going to kind of talk about the history of the Loveland Bike Trail, the development, how they got businesses in there, obstacles that they've had throughout. So we're, again, inviting everyone to come out, and Dave's excited to talk and kind of share the history of how the bike trail became a destination for everybody. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, can you repeat the date and time of the meeting about Wasson Trail, please?
It's
Or Wasson
this
Way?
Saturday, May 1st. We'll start around 1 o'clock. Dave will be speaking at 2 p.m. It'll be at the small shelter located next to the amphitheater, right next to the bike trail.
And where at?
Loveland, downtown Loveland.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next request to address council is Donna Lake.
Thank you. Donna Lake, 5407 Mount Crest Drive. It's good to be on this side for a change. I just came to let you know of a couple of things that are happening. As part of the park audit, when we were going through and doing that, it was noticed that there were no recycling cans anywhere in the parks, and I walk out at Great Parks of Hamilton County a lot, and they have the recycling bins right next to the garbage cans, and so I called them, and they told me that they had bought them from Hamilton County Environmental Services. I contacted them and inquired as to whether or not that would qualify for the grant process that they had, and long story short, I've worked with these people in the past, and they ended up giving us 20 of those recycling containers. So thank you to Clint Zimmerman and Public Works. Those went out in the last week or two. They're in every park. Anything that is placed into those, plastic or aluminum, will count towards our recycling, and what we're trying to do is get our recycling up to 20%. If we can divert 20% of our solid waste from the landfill and put into recycling, the recycling money goes up exponentially. So that's one thing. Because I got that, Mayor Schneider was interested in pursuing that grant. It's called Solid Waste Innovation Grant Program. And the purpose of it is to divert material from the solid waste landfill. And Mayor Schneider was interested in starting a composting program in Norwood. And so Tom Perry and I got together and we submitted a grant. And we were notified a couple weeks ago that we were awarded that grant. We did get notification that the Hamilton County Commissioners approved the expenditure, and so it's all official now. We sent the invoice in. What we're going to do is buy 60 compost bins that are up on legs, that are rodent-proof. There are 2 containers on each side, so you have 2 containers. You can start a compost on one and get a little further along and then start the other. We have to report every quarter about how much yard waste or food waste, which is really easy to compost, how much of that has been diverted. To make this successful, we involved Hamilton County Environmental Services to come out and give a short half-hour, 40-minute presentation on how to be successful in composting. If they are unable to come, Renee Durker, who lives on Floral Avenue, is a master gardener, and she has agreed to do classes as well. And so this is a 2-year grant. We have 2 years to buy the compost bins and 2 years to report. My hope is that there will be 60 people right away who will be interested in this. So our timeline, the purpose of the grant was to initiate backyard composting program, to make composting a habit, and then to spread enthusiasm to increase the number of composters. The timeline, we are in the process of developing an application process. You'll just have to say that you live in Norwood and that you'll agree to compost, and we'll send out emails every quarter so that you can report whether you're still composting or not. Hopefully you are. We'll send out tips about being successful for composting. We will purchase those composters in May, assuming we get the check from the county by then. Clint Zimmerman at Public Works will accept all of those, and then we will start doing the classes, have people sign up, and doing the classes in June. So we're getting ready to rock and roll. I wanted to talk about it now, even though we don't have the composters, because Hamilton, I've seen on social media, Hamilton County Environmental Services is in the process of having their compost and rain barrel sale. Their composters sit on the ground, and I had one when I lived on Atlantic Avenue, and the snakes loved it. They would come up out of the ground. It just sits on the ground. These are pretty much rodent-proof. They sit up on legs. So I just wanted the citizens to know to kind of look out for social media. I'm sure Mayor Schneider will put it in the city newsletter, and we'll do the application process. Just wanted to make you all aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our last request to address council. We'll move on to item I, reports of standing committees of council, Parks, Recreation, and Public Places Committee meeting, April 14th, 2021. Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Parks, Recreation, and Public Spaces, to whom is referred trees and tree planting, park renovations, and citizen-led projects, beg leave to submit the following report. On April 14th, 2021, our committee heard from Mr. Kraby, the new Recreation Director, came out to introduce himself and meet the members of the committee. We heard from Dana Bowl on the Pocket Park near Wasson Way. Our committee heard updates from Norwood Together on Cleanup Day and the Leonard Park updates, along with their future grant opportunities and park opportunities that they're working on. We heard from Candace Winterbauer about trees that they wish to plant in Norwood, which I believe they planted some at Burwood Park already, which they coordinated with Clint Zimmerman, Public Works, and the administration on that. And we discussed planning to reignite the tree board here in Norwood. And I gave updates on 2021 park renovations, the parks that we chose for that, that we're going to work on outside of Hunter, which is still ongoing, is Lower Millcrest, as well as that middle area by the train tracks, and Fenwick Park. Respectfully submitted, Chris Kelch, Chairperson, Mr. DiNardo, Mr. Geraci, and Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to make a motion to receive and file.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to receive and file the report. May I have a second? Mr. Gabbard.
I'll make the second.
Second by Mr. Gabbard. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item J, third reading of ordinances, resolutions. Resolution declaring it necessary to levy a tax in excess of a 10 mil limitation and to notify the Board of Elections of Hamilton County to cause the notice of election to be given as required by the law on the question of levying of an 8 mil renewal property tax for the current operating expenses of the City of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Mr. Geraci.
Make a motion to have third reading.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to have the third reading. Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have the third reading?
Resolution declaring it necessary to levy a tax in excess of the 10 mil limitation and to notify the Board of Elections of Hamilton County to cause the notice of election to be given as required by law on the question of levying an 8 mil renewal property tax for the current operating expenses of the City of Norwood and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. DiNardo.
I would like to make a motion that we pass.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to pass the ordinance. Mr. Geraci.
I think it's a resolution. But
I'm sorry, resolution.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Motion by Mr. DiNardo to pass the resolution. Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Resolution passes. Moving on to item K, second reading of ordinances, resolutions. Item K1, an ordinance authorizing cooperation with the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority to facilitate the issuance of Port Authority Development Revenue Bonds for the purpose of refunding of the city's outstanding tax increment financing revenue bonds, Series 600, Cornerstone at Norwood Project, authorizing the execution and delivery of a tax increment financing and cooperative agreement, a second amended and restated service agreement, and all other documents and instruments necessary to effect such refunding, authorizing and approving related matters, and declaring emergency.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would ask if we could have either Pat Woodside and/or Andy Broussard to speak before we make this motion, just to get an update and make sure, see if we need to have both readings tonight or if we only need one. So.
Gentlemen?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your...
Just basically just to provide an update so that it can inform us on whether we do need to pass this tonight, or if something has changed, then we potentially don't need to pass.
Oh, no, it does need to be passed today. We're moving forward with it. This, just to refresh your memory briefly, is the refinancing of the Cornerstone TIF bonds. We're going to enter into a cooperative agreement with the Port Authority. The Port Authority is actually going to issue bonds, but those bonds will be what they refer to as through their bond fund, which gives additional security for the repayment of the bonds, therefore lowering the interest rate payable and stabilizing the project a little bit with respect to the revenues relative to the amount of debt service on the bonds. I think Andy maybe some math on that, but if you have any questions about the ordinance or legal aspects of it, let me know.
I mean, I guess I would say, whatever you were going to say, Andy, feel free, but I mean, it would be good just to know kind of where this all landed when it comes to the interest rates, if things go up or down, just for informational purposes.
Yeah, so just to set the stage a little bit in terms of where the tax collections are for the TIF and the payments on the bonds as we go forward if we didn't do anything here. The property owners have to come out of pocket about $250,000 to $300,000 a year extra because of the valuation has dropped on those two buildings. So this is going to modify that to be in about the $85,000 to $90,000 range, only they're going to come out of pocket for what they call the minimum service payment agreement. So we were able to lock in the rates. This is a taxable deal because of the private payment coming from the property owners to make the debt service payment, which is a little bit different than last time, but the taxable rate is about 3% for the financing, which is really about where it's been locked in at. So really, the transaction, there's a private investor already lined up. So transaction's ready to go. It's just a matter of documenting it. We do have time is of the essence here because there are certain dates we're allowed to call the old bonds. And these can be written in all kinds of different ways, but for whatever reason, these bonds were written in a way that said only on interest payment dates, which is June 1st and December 1st, can we call these bonds. And if we don't call them this June, the property owners have to come out of pocket with some serious cash to make this year's payments. So by beating that, we're able to shrink that cost from that $250,000 number down to $90,000.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? Mr. Bonzo?
Yeah, so I would just make the motion that we have the second and third reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo to have the second and third reading. Mr. Braden?
Second.
Second by Mr. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. May we have the second and third reading?
An ordinance authorizing cooperation with the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority to facilitate the issuance of Port Authority Development revenue bonds for the purpose of refunding of the city's outstanding tax increment financing revenue bonds, Series 2006, Cornerstone at Norwood project, authorizing the execution and delivery of a tax increment financing and cooperative agreement, a second amended and restated service agreement, and all other documents and instruments necessary to effect such refunding, authorizing and approving related matters, and declaring an emergency. An ordinance authorizing cooperation with the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority to facilitate the issuance of Port Authority Development revenue bonds for the purpose of refunding of the city's outstanding tax increment financing revenue bonds, Series 2006, Cornerstone at Norwood project, authorizing the execution and delivery of a tax increment financing and cooperative agreement, a second amended and restated service agreement, and all other documents and instruments necessary to effect such refunding, authorizing and approving related matters, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Braden.
Motion, we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Braden that we pass the ordinance. Mr. Thompson.
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to K2, an ordinance authorizing the City of Norwood to enter into community reinvestment area agreements with Playing Card Partners, LLC, authorizing the city to enter into a related school compensation with the Norwood City School District and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
Suppose we have the second reading.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the second reading. Mr. Bonzel.
I'd like to second that.
Second by Mr. Bonzel. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, Mr. Mayor, after the readings, I was just going to see if we wanted to invite Nick Lingenfelter here. We should have probably to see if he has anything he wants to say on the matter, but we could probably do that.
Okay. Maybe we have the second reading?
Okay. An ordinance authorizing the City of Norwood to enter into community reinvestment area agreements with Playing Card Partners, LLC, authorizing the city to enter into a related school compensation with the Norwood City School District and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, yeah, I just wanted to see.
Actually passing, sorry. We're just doing a second reading tonight.
Correct.
Okay, so make sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yeah, did you want to say anything about this tonight?
I did. You guys can, it's up to you guys to give a quick update.
Yeah, I think if maybe
That's
get an
fine.
update from him, I think that'd be a good idea for the citizens.
Thank you. Nick Lingenfelter with PLK. I know we've all met before, so I just wanted to give a few quick updates. We are anticipating you guys having the final CRA and TIF once the school board meets the 11th of next month. So right now, the school board has an emergency meeting at 6:45, and after that, we will come over here immediately afterwards for the final CRA agreements. At this point right now, we have executed all of our site contracts, and we are ready to start, but we legally can't start or we void the CRA if we start before it's been voted on by both the school board and council. So that is why we can't have the vote yet, because we need to wait till that's in place. So I just wanted you to know we will be back on the 11th, and I'm here to answer any questions if there were any that came up. Your approvals will cover both Phase 1A and Phase 1B's CRA, as well as the TIF for all of Phase 1. So that's the retail, the residential, everything that's going to be built in Phase 1. We've had a few phone calls recently, so I did want to make sure I clear this up. There have been no changes to the final PUD that was presented to you all in January. So if you've heard something different, that's news to us. We're full steam ahead on our plans. Again, we have signed the site contract, and we're scheduled to actually begin work on site on the 17th, and they'll be staging after the city council vote that week, the 11th and 12th. So there are two material, like I would call them immaterial changes to the site plan that are in compliance with the PUD, but I did want to bring them up so everybody is aware. There was, when we met with the Planning Commission, there was a concern that there might not be enough parking along the Kenilworth side. So we have been able to add an additional podium there to get us an additional 150 parking spaces. We're doing that at our cost, not funded by TIF dollars or anything, at roughly $4 million, but that'll get about 360 spaces along the Kenilworth side. That's the first thing that we agreed to do, and we actually think it'll help balance the project overall, and we're just going to go ahead and incur the cost today versus doing it in 12 to 18 months. The second thing that we did is there were two smaller buildings on Kenilworth that made 100 units. We combined the two, which let us gain 18 units and added in 2 elevators, because we're having a lot of demand in the market for elevator buildings. So that also helps open up the buildings to older residents as well. So every building on site will now have an elevator. That's the only changes that we've had, but aesthetically, everything is, as you've visually seen, there's no materials that have changed. Nothing has changed on the site. One final update that we had is the public art agreement. We agreed to sign an agreement recently with Agar, who's behind Blink. And Agar is going to be helping us oversee all the public art installations on the site. So there will be more to come. They'll be engaging the community. They'll be meeting with the art committee, everything else. but we wanted to get a professional organization that specializes in this to help us spearhead this and make sure it's the right art for the project, the right community, and then that way it's also, both sides have a common group that they can meet with as well. So other than that, I don't have any other major updates to the project, but be glad to take any questions if you have them.
Mr. Tracy?
When you said you added parking to the Kenilworth side, you're talking about on the property itself?
On the property itself, yes, sir. Yep. So between us and Multicolor, there was a surface lot.
Yep.
And what we were able to do is because the site falls off, we were able to keep one at grade and do one underneath. And
I just wanted to clarify that for the residents that might be over there listening, thinking that
no, it's physical in our property. You won't even see it from the street. The building is going to wrap around the parking garage.
I understand.
Yep.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Moving on to item L, introductory reading of ordinances and resolutions. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to have all 3 readings.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have all 3 readings. Bonzel.
I'd like to second that, please.
Second by Mr. Bonzel. Any discussion? Mr. Tracy.
Through the chair to Mr. DiNardo, maybe you know a little bit more than I would at this point. Is this 2096 fund, is that the federal, is that federal relief money?
I don't know that, actually, if it's state or federal. It is federal?
Yeah, Sanford.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah. Was that the only question?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Anyone else? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. May I have a motion, gentlemen?
Sure.
Mr. DiNardo?
Can we pass this ordinance, please?
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to pass the ordinance. Mr. Braden?
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
I'm sorry, that was DiNardo and Braden?
Yes.
Please.
Okey-dokey.
One and only.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item L2. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Safety Service to enter into a contract under the Hamilton County Purchasing Master Bid Service Program for the purchase of a 2021 Ford F-250 pickup truck and declaring an emergency. Mr. Tracy.
I'd like to make a motion to have all 3 readings of this tonight.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to have all 3 readings. Mr. Kelch.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Safety Service to enter into a contract under the Hamilton County Purchasing Master Bid Service Program for the purchase of a 2021 Ford F-250 pickup truck and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Safety Service to enter into a contract under the Hamilton County Purchasing Master Bid Service Program for the purchase of a 2021 Ford F-250 pickup truck and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Safety Service to enter into a contract under the Hamilton County Purchasing Master Bid Service Program for the purchase of a 2021 Ford F-250 pickup truck and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to make a motion that this pass.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo? Any discussion? Mr. Geraci?
While this seems like just a regular F-250 pickup, this is for our waterworks department, and it's going to be a dump truck. So I want to make sure that those watching know that this is not going to be just an F-250 truck. This is going to be a workhorse for the Public Works Department. Over the years, they've been neglected, just like some of the parks and some of the roads. So, I'm glad to see that we're finally stepping up to help out a department that busts their butt every day. And it's deserved to at least have this, if not a few other items. So I'm glad that this came up to our table today.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Anyone else? Motion by Mr. Geraci, second by Mr. DiNardo to pass the ordinance. Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Counsel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item M, administrative reports. Mayor Schneider.
Thank you. A couple different things going on. We had the Financial Recovery Commission meeting today. Again, about an hour meeting going through the process of trying to get everything squared away. We did not go over the numbers, but the numbers are out there, and I think the auditor's office has posted new numbers, and everybody should have received them. But we did go over the requirements to get out of the fiscal emergency, and we are very close. We talked a lot about the accounting methods and the process that needs to be completed to clear some of the accounting methods that are there. We talked a little bit about some of the things that have been taken care of and some of the things that have been tested, but there's quite a few items that need to be worked on. It's not really a huge lift. It is a matter of having the time to put the effort into putting some things in place. And of course, a lot of it hinges on the treasurer's office and the auditor's office, and they've had a lot of different challenges just with COVID and everything else going on. So we're moving forward, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I'd like to say that we'll be out of this right away, but I think it's going to be the end of the year before we see ourselves being lifted out of that. We did have a meeting with the city, with all the department heads, about the emergency operations plan, and there's a member of the police department, a member of the fire department that's driving that at this point. We're using Hamilton County Emergency Management. They have a website and templates and all sorts of information for municipalities, local jurisdictions to take advantage of. So we're making progress there. We haven't had that emergency management plan in place for quite a few years. Well, it's been in place. I should say it's been in place for quite a few years. It just hasn't been updated. It's extremely old. So we're going to get that updated, and it's nice to have the resources that the Hamilton County Emergency Management Services have for us to work on that. There are many events planned for the summer. I'm sure each of you and anybody else out there has been seeing events come across their computers, whether you're on Facebook or emails and all of that. So much like Shakespeare in the Park is going to be going on. I know that the high school just did a production of Shakespeare, and they did it outside. It was the first time. They weren't able to hold the high school production last year. This year they held it outside, and I hear it was a smashing success. A couple of my kids went to it, and my daughter was actually involved in a part of it, but it was really interesting. And then having Shakespeare in the Park, they're planned to be in all the different community parks this summer. That's going to be a lot of fun. The Off-Pike Farmers Market is going to be going again this year. Reviews and plans for the new recreation center. New recreation center director is working on that and working with the safety service director, trying to come up with some stuff there. The new recreation director is working with the Avenues for Success, which is one of the after-school programs. Laura Ferguson, and working closely with her, they're actually providing the lifeguard training again, and it'll be free to kids and adults that want to be involved in that lifeguard training. So there have been some notices that have went out on that. They updated the Facebook page on the Recreation Facebook page, so take a look at that. And then some of you might have noticed, and I think it was mentioned even, that there's some speed indicators out on telephone poles in 2 or 3 areas. That is something that the chief of police is working on, getting them out there. They're looking at 5 or 6 different areas. I hate to say it again, Chief Kramer, the first thing he mentions about that is, yeah, Clint Zimmerman with Public Works, and the Public Works guys are doing a great job helping them get that up and running. And then the compost idea, I'd like to say that compost idea was all my idea, but actually on the home house tour that we had last year, which was just a walking outside home house tour, but it was very informative. We stopped by the home of Emily Franzen. We all remember or call her sort of the bee person, right? She was the bee person that came to council. But Emily had this compost bin that was really tidy, and I'll call it tidy because all the other compost bins I've ever seen have been a mess. They're on the ground, they're just a mess, like Donna was talking about. But this was a really tidy setup, and she talked about how it sort of works, and that was where really the inspiration of trying to get this going came from Emily Franzen, and I think it's a great idea, especially right now. We're all planting our gardens, we're planting different things, and that's a great place to get some good, really good materials for your garden stuff. So those are some of the important things that have been going on. Most important is that compost pile system. That's all I had. If you have some questions.
Any questions or comments for Mayor Schneider? Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, going back to the first point about getting out, it sounds like financially, though, the plan and all the work that's been done in the past couple of years, that part's A-okay, or at least they probably won't nod their head yes, but you got the sense that it's really just tick the boxes on the treasurer and the auditor side, and we'd be
Yeah, we've got a solid 5-year plan if things continue going the way they are. Of course, there's always the what ifs, and that's their concern. But we have a good 5-year plan in place. That's not our biggest challenge at this point.
That's great to hear. I'm glad that they received it.
Mr. Brady.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. In listening to that meeting today, one thing was clear, that no one really cares if we get out of this or not more than we do. So I did hear something about, because I feel like we're poised and we're ready. But I heard something about like a team leader where I don't want to steal your thunder, Ken. I don't know how far you're going to go into this, but if you can even talk about it. But someone in charge of actually checking those boxes, like Mr. DiNardo said, like someone in charge that said, hey, that somebody has to answer to. I don't know. Any closer to? I mean, I just don't want to prolong this longer than it has to be. But that was discussed. How far into that are you? Because I didn't really get the gist of it. So talk about that.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that was brought up, they said we have multiple departments on some of these that have to be involved. And there wasn't, one of the commission members, Bradley Schwartz, brought up was, we need one person, or who's the clearinghouse person, who's making sure that this is well-directed and orchestrated, and then setting up waypoints as we go. Clearly, it cannot be council members. The only person that can actually check off the boxes and say that we've completed that work is the Auditor of State's office, is our supervisor. And I think she made that clear in that conversation. But that doesn't mean that we cannot, that President Miracle and I cannot work together to come up with the right plan and the right people and the right waypoints and checkpoints to say, this is how quickly we feel like it can be done. So we'll be working on those things. But ultimately that comes down from, the departments either come, most of them are under me, and the law department's involved in a few, and the treasurers and the auditors, but we've all got to work together. But we do need to set specific targets and goals. Yes.
Thank you.
I don't know that answers.
Good enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonzo.
So I know we're going to talk, I think we're going to talk about this during another point in the meeting, but just while we're talking about it, I'm going to point this out. So I mean, at one point in this meeting, the mayor was, he was pretty adamant that, we need to get a move in on this, essentially. And it sounded like at least the chair of the board really was like pushing it back to like, hey, maybe your city council, they need to deal with this, essentially. And the thing is, city council, just to note, I mean, we don't, we learned from the last mayor, God love him, but we don't control the mayor, we don't control the treasurer, we don't control the auditor, and we definitely don't control the law director. So essentially, we don't have really any authority over them, and we also don't know what they're looking for either. And so we're going to talk about the spreadsheet in a minute, but I just think it's adamant that we continue to push, and you did do that today. I did watch the meeting, I appreciate that, but we continue to push the auditors of state to let us know, like, is what we're doing good enough to check the box? If not, but I do feel like we're kind of getting ignored a little bit, and frankly, I think I'm just surprised that we're not closer, and I think part of it is because of the lack of communication from them. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for representing us and keep doing it because we went out of this thing. So
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Anyone else? Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Move on to item N, unfinished business. Mr. Kelch?
Thank you, Mr. President. So over the last couple meetings, we've discussed kind of the nuisance property appeals board. We've put it on hold for a couple weeks. Hopefully that gave everybody else, a couple more extra weeks to kind of look at resumes, mull it over, get a hold of people, and kind of think about, who they would like to see on this thing. As a member of that committee that brought this to council, as somebody who largely helped co-write this ordinance, I've spent a lot of time reading these resumes, putting together, people that I think that's going to be on this board, serve Norwood in the best way possible, and the property owners that have appeals to this ordinance. So with that, I want to name off a couple nominations here. My roster. For the one-year appointment, I would like to nominate Brittany Kelch. She has experience in policy, procedures, and process. For the two-year position, I would like to nominate Emily Dilly. She also has experience in process. And she had something on her resume that really struck hard to me. It was where she's saying she's going to operate on facts, not emotion. So that's something, when you get people in there potentially angry at you, that's really going to be important. For the three-year appointment, I'd like to nominate Mr. Anthony Williams. He has a lot of experience as a contractor, so dealing with some of these property owners, I think he's going to be really beneficial to that team as far as, things that come from the health department, the building department, and all that. He's got a lot of experience there and can help educate the rest of the members of that appeals board if we so vote that way. So with that said, those are my nominations for each position of the nuisance property appeals board.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Tracy?
I would like to echo the same thing as Mr. Kelch, and while we hadn't discussed it, I think it's pretty interesting that he brought the same names to the table that I had. As most of you know, I do a lot of research. I put a lot of effort into what I do. So I went through and I did pros and cons. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my notepad with the pros and cons on it for each person. However, I was impressed with the three resumes that Mr. Kelch just mentioned. He beat me to the punch here tonight, running with the first nomination. But I would echo those three as well as three candidates I would put up for nomination to this board.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Bonzo?
Thank you, Mr. President. So, I did have a different name that I wanted to see considered, and I did want to see Linwell James considered. We've had him speak at our city council meetings multiple times. He's very intelligent. He had a letter of recommendation from Detective Devers from the police department in his packet as well. I personally think even if we do just a one-year appointment, that lets him to see if he where he likes to, if that's kind of what he wants to do, if he likes it, and then he can always petition for, a reappointment at that time. But I would like to see us consider him. The names that I kind of had were Emily Dilly for a 3-year term, Brittany Kelch for 2, and then Linwell James for a 1-year term. Just when we're looking at it. So just my thoughts, I think we should, though, figure out a way to get Linwell an appointment person. So I think that it would be a good opportunity for him, and I think that his past experience, like I said, in the Explorers program and others, I think it would just be a good thing for us to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I could respond to Mr. Bonzo through the chair. Lemuel was one of my considerations, one of the close ones. For me personally, what I'm thinking about this process of what we're going to be encountering is people that have a lot of experience, whether it's management, whether it's process, whether it's dealing with people at that higher level. And to me, he's a little younger. He doesn't have a lot of experience, especially in home ownership or property ownership. So what I want is the people up there that are property owners, I'm not just going to say homeowners, but property owners that are going to be judging on appeals basically of other property owners. So that was the hard decision I had to make earlier, and it was literally on my way here. I'm driving thinking he's on my mind. I was able to speak to Pastor James about this earlier just before the meeting, so it wasn't a shock to him that I told him I'm not going to nominate him. But it's basically that, is the non-home ownership or property ownership, I apologize, and just the inexperience compared to some of the rest of the field.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Tracy.
And again, Mr. James was very high on my list as well. When I went through and ranked my persons that I was going through, I had a number system that I ranked, and he literally missed it by about a half a point. And it was just kind of the same statements that Mr. Kelch made. I think the biggest portion where he missed the points was that home ownership. And while you can look at your parents and see how they keep their home and how they, have brought you up to keep that home up, I think it's a better experience when you're on your own, having your own home to deal with versus having multiple people around. But again, he just missed my list by a little bit, and I was trying to be as fair as I could by utilizing the number system.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Bonds.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, I know this is a tough discussion for all of us because, we know, I know all of these people that we're talking about today. I would just say I don't know if we should make home ownership necessarily I don't know if we should set the precedent that is like a requirement. There's lots of people that don't own homes in the city that are affected by chronic nuisance properties. And this is essentially an appeals board, so the city would be coming to this board and making its case about why the appeal should not be granted. The property owner, whether it be a apartment building or a commercial building or what have you, they would be making their case about why the appeal should be granted. And we would want people to use judgment and think about is there some common ground? Is there something we can do? Can we work with them? So I just don't want to put so much emphasis on property ownership. And I'll just say, when I first got elected to city council, I did not own property in the city. So we bought property very soon thereafter, but I didn't when I was first elected. So I just don't think it's I just wouldn't make that such a strong requirement that for something that is an appeals board.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mr. Kelch.
I think, Mr. President, if I could respond. So it's not so much the requirement, it's like, so you're saying when you first ran for council, you weren't a property owner, that's fine. It's not a requirement to run for council and be a property owner. But the reason we want property owners on this appeals board is that the renter is being, not necessarily being affected by this ordinance. The renter is not. The renter is dealing with the landlord, third party, separated from the nuisance violations. Sure, they're going to have nuisance neighbors and that they're going to call on and be a part of, but when it comes down to the brass tacks and the teeth of this ordinance of the fines, the letters, the structure, it's all property owners. So if I rent this house, I'm being a knucklehead and I get a letter, doesn't affect me. It's the property owner that it affects. So what we want is other property owners that have that experience, that have that vested interest on this appeals board so that they can rule on appeals based on other property owners. If that makes sense, if that clears anything up. This isn't something, like, everybody keeps thinking that this is something to do with renters. It's not renters. It's property owners, and we made sure we were explicit in saying that. It's the property owners. Whoever owns that property, whether they are local, whether they are in like Arizona, those are the ones that are going to be affected by this ordinance, by those renters that rent their properties, or by the homeowners themselves by the actions that they choose to take. So, to me, personally, I don't think that it's kind of fair or responsible of us to have somebody that's not a property owner on that board kind of making judgments on if they're going to appeal, or if they're going to grant or deny an appeal for a property owner who appealed the ordinance. Like, I just don't think it makes too much sense. So that's why, for me, we're going with property owners.
Thank you, Mr. Kels. Mr. Thompson?
I think it would be wrong to discount renters in this situation. I think most people affected by this will actually be renters, even if it is the landlord that is being brought to court. It's oftentimes in these situations, renters are the victims because they are there in the property where the nuisance violation is taking place. They can also be retaliated against by the landlords. If the landlords don't comply, the renters are out of the house, or landlords might encourage renters to not make complaints because the landlords don't want to face this board. So I think it's wrong to discount renters in this situation. For me, there's a couple names I would like to see on here, that, or at least one that's on here that's not been mentioned. But I think the most important thing about this board is that they apply their rulings fairly and equitably. Nationally, chronic nuisance issues like these tend to single out lower income and people of color in neighborhoods because the boards tend to turn a blind eye to other groups. And we don't want that to happen here, and that's why we need a very good, well-rounded board to represent this city. So just saying that homeowners should be judging homeowners or property owners, I disagree with, because there are a lot of people who are being affected by this that aren't property owners. For me, the other person I'd like to see is Paige Jesse considered. I don't have a particular length of term, but she has very good qualifications working with low-income children and families. And being that these kinds of issues typically affect those kinds of people, I would like to see somebody like that on the board.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Braden?
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. All good people. All names have been discussed. I would definitely vote for. I would like to add one more thing to the whole. There's lots of reasons why people rent. So there's lots of people that could own if they wanted to, but they choose to rent. And there's a whole lot of reasons that they do so. So I'm kind of with you, Mr. Thompson. I think you said it well. I don't think we should discount home ownership as a disqualification, because I know that there are good, solid people out there that do not own homes on purpose. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Who's hand? Mr. Kels, I see your hand up.
Yes, Mr. President. I mean, we're talking about an ordinance that affects homeowners, and we're talking about other homeowners overseeing those appeals, yes or no on those appeals. I mean, we're not talking about kicking renters out. If the renter is getting evicted, it's probably because they're being a nuisance, and that property owner is at our appeals board saying, hey, we abated the problem. They're out. They're not going to be, I don't think they're going to be kicking out just anybody and everybody. I can't see it happening. I don't have the ordinance right in front of me, but there is language in there that kind of protects people, renters, that want to disclose information about their landlord and protects them from being retaliated against. I mean, we kind of discussed this ordinance at length, and we're not really here to discuss that, but I will gladly revisit that we are trying to protect renters here, but the renters aren't paying the fines. The renters aren't having to show up to file an appeal. So for me, having homeowners and sits here judging other homeowners is appropriate and well-rounded. I mean, I pick these people based on their experience with process, not their experience on low-income housing. I mean, I think those are parallel issues, being housing issues, but not the same. They're not intersecting. They're not perpendicular in this case. So.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Tracy?
And just to respond to Mr. Thompson, I do appreciate your nomination. You know, when I started this process with Mr. Kelch, both of us had done a lot of research, and I believe the 4 ordinances that I narrowed down to kind of mimic or mirror do not include an appeals board. This was something that Mr. Kelch and I had discussed, whether or not to even put this in here, but we felt to be fair to the residents, to the lower income, to the upper income, to the middle income, the fairest way is to have a citizen-led appeals board that is outside of the city administration making the final decision if there is a final decision to be made, which, you know, I appreciate that you had your comments for the person you nominated, and that was wonderful, and that was one thing that we had thought about when we were developing this ordinance. One thing that the appeals board is one of those groundbreaking things that, you know, no other city that has this type of ordinance has an appeals board. It is what it is, and you go to mayor's court and you can fight it in mayor's court if you so choose, which is a pain in the butt process. And I'm glad that we've come up with a middleman, so to speak, versus going straight to court, and not having it to be a criminal violation, so to speak, and just doing it civilly, because I feel that, you know, we don't need to put things on people's records that they don't really need, to be honest.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Bonzo?
Thank you, Mr. President. So essentially, I mean, when a motion gets made, essentially a motion needs to get 4 votes to have this approved. I'm going to go ahead and make a motion, and then if it's voted down,
I have a motion on the
it's
table.
voted down, then it can be...
I have a motion already. Point of order. I already had a motion.
I'm sorry.
Nobody seconded your motion. You didn't make a motion, you just said that you would like to nominate some people, but there was no motion
Gentlemen,
made.
I understand. I did not hear a motion, Mr. Kelch.
I'm going to regain my time if I could.
Mr. Bonzo, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I would like to make a motion to nominate Emily Dilly for a 3-year term, Brittany Kelch for a 2-year term, and Linwell James for a 1-year term on the Chronic Nuisance Appeals Board.
We have a motion by Mr. Bonsall. Do I have a second? I do not have a second, Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you.
Motion fails. Mr. Kelch?
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Brittany Kelch for the 1 year, Emily Dilly for the 2-year, and Anthony Williams for the 3-year.
May I have a second? Mr. Tracy?
Second that motion.
Second by Mr. Tracy. Any discussion? Mr. Braden?
Yeah, so just to be clear on Mr. Kelch's, it's Brittany Kelch, and it's Anthony Williams, and give me a third name.
Emily Dilly.
Emily Dilly.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Narno?
Thank you.
I have a question to the law director, please. If I wanted, if a person wanted some, but there was one name on there that in a world swapped for, things like that, do we just keep going around until a motion is made at which 4 people were okay with that?
Mr. Moore?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would recommend, if that's the situation, is to open it for an option. So for the 1-year term, the President Counsel, okay, I'm taking nominations for the 1-year term.
Yeah.
I would nominate and then somebody else says, I nominate, and then once all the nominations are closed, then, okay, how many votes do we have for this person? How many for that? How many?
We've done that
That's the way
before,
I
and that
would-
seemed
yeah.
to be easier for, otherwise, if I did, yeah, thanks.
If there was a consensus, then a motion doing all of them would be fine. We do that for like.
Would you guys be okay with?
The OKI nomination kind of thing. It's just like, anybody want to do it? Yeah, okay, I'll do it. So, okay, I make a motion, he's it. So, but yeah, I would do the nomination process for this.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Kelch?
So some clarification on why I wanted to do it that way is packaging it like I did. Because I know in the past we have done that. Is that my proximity to this ordinance with Mr. Tracy of co-writing this thing for as long as I did. I said, hey, these are the three people that I see that I think is a good fit, and with that proximity, I kind of felt maybe that looked at as a, hey, this guy kind of thinks that way. He was so involved with this thing that it would be fine like that. I mean, that's why I did it as such.
Okay.
I don't know if that changes anybody's opinion here, but.
Well, the motion's been made and seconded, right, Mr. Moore?
Correct.
Is there any further discussion? Call the roll, Mrs. Williams.
Mr. Bonzel?
No.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Braden?
Yes.
Mr. Braden, yes. All members present voting, we have 4 ayes, 3 noes, the motion passes. Thank you, gentlemen. Any other unfinished business to discuss? I would like to speak to the FRP meeting that we had this morning. Anna Mary, our financial supervisor, had sent me an updated spreadsheet this morning, and I'm going to share that with you gentlemen tomorrow. I received it this morning. I would like to send that to you, and then I would like to have a committee of the whole next week so that we could talk specifically about the report on accounting methods. So I wanted to see what evening was good for everyone next week.
Thursday's out for me.
Thursday's out for you?
We do. I'd propose Tuesday at 7:30 in keeping with the rhythm. It works for
Tuesday?
my work schedule, so selfishly, I'd like to propose that.
7:30?
Yes, please.
You want to do earlier than that? No, 7:30?
I wouldn't be able to come earlier myself, but.
Perfect.
So if everyone's good with next Tuesday, that is May the 4th, 7:30 PM, I will get that out. We will have a committee of the whole, and we will be discussing the report on accounting methods.
Will that be located here? President?
Yes. Mr. Bonzel?
Thank you, Mr. President. So, I mean, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I mean, I don't honestly know how fruitful this discussion is really going to be, but if we have I would like to see, if we do have the discussion, the auditor, the treasurer, law director, and the mayor invited to attend it, because there's, things that are on there. I don't know about the law director, but a lot of these have ordinances, so you should probably come. And then the other thing is I'd really like to see either April or Anna Mary. Anna Mary is the one that's really doing the, yes or no on compliance, April or supervisor, but I'd like to see one of them be there so that, we can, I've heard in the past, the auditor or the treasurer tell me, we're in compliance, right? And then the spreadsheet says we're not, and it's kind of frustrating because it's like, I don't know exactly what the state is looking for, and potentially nobody else does either. So, would you need me to repeat that?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. So, I think the auditor, the treasurer, the law director, the mayor, and Anna Mary and April from the state should be.
Even if we can't have them here in person, maybe we can have them here
Yeah, if we can,
virtually.
they probably can't come in person, but if they come virtually, that would be great. But
That's the same day as a primary?
it is, yeah. But I mean, there's no primary in Norwood, but if there's.
Election day.
We had a council meeting on the presidential election day, I'm pretty sure, in November, so, when everybody was voting.
So did you list everyone?
I think so, yep.
Okay.
Did you have anybody that I missed?
No, I don't think so. I will reach out to Anna Mary and April and see if one of them can be here virtually. But ultimately, they are the financial supervisor, and they have the last word. So what I'd like to do is to get these updates more frequently from them, so that we can, so we have a scorecard here, so we know what's going on and what we need to do, and get feedback from her. Because we cannot get out of fiscal emergency until these are completed and she approves it. I know there's some testing that's involved that she has to do. There's many of them in her process, and that's what I'd like to share with everyone in the group next Tuesday.
Yeah, and then the other request I would have is that the 4 people I mentioned at the city, that they can review the spreadsheet. Anything that touches their office, if they could provide some kind of a reply on it, just maybe an email to the council that we can have that essentially just says for number 10, this is my update on it. Number 11, this is my update. It'd be good if we can get that before the meeting so that we can all be on the same page.
Well, I've already emailed that to them.
And so, okay, so if we could just ask them for that update before the meeting,
right,
that would be great. So
and I know there's something that Mr. DiNardo and I've been talking about, and I have reached out, and I've actually gotten some other municipalities and what their financial policy documents are, and so that I can share this with you guys next Tuesday night as well, and there's something there that we can use and then apply it to Norwood, save some time. Certainly, that's something we can do as well. But, yeah. So next Tuesday, 7:30, I'll reach out to Anna Mary and the rest of the folks that you had listed, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, another piece of new business. If possible, I'd like to add an item to that committee of the whole. If you'll remember, quite a while ago, we were back in the gymnasium. Chief Kramer came to talk about some efforts that police were doing for a variety of things. But one thing he had mentioned was the state of our police department's body cameras, and that they were, one, we don't have enough of them, and 2, they're getting pretty old. And we've been in conversation recently about upgrading the police's body camera system and the numbers that we have, and I would like to include in that committee of the whole discussion of body cameras and invite Chief Kramer or representative from the department to come and discuss the need for them, the costs associated with getting new ones, and see what we have to do to get that request processed. I think it's more important now than ever that we have our officers wearing working body cameras, and currently that's not always the case.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Anyone else? Unfinished business. Mr. Dracy?
Oh, were you still on unfinished business?
Yes.
I thought new business, I'm sorry.
That's all good.
We were too.
Well, we can,
no,
if there's no other unfinished, then we'll go straight into new business. Mr. Dracy?
I've got a few requests, and I apologize for this. I'd like to have a housing, health, and public safety meeting next Tuesday. Committee of whole kind of took my time slot, so I'd like to do it at 6 p.m. if possible. We'll just stack them on top of each other if we can. And this would be for the meet and greet of the nuisance appeals board members, to talk to them about what we are looking for, and basically meet and greet them.
What date did you say?
May 4th, next Tuesday.
Didn't we already talk about something next Tuesday?
Yeah, 7:30.
Huh?
He's
That's
saying 6 o'clock.
Committee of the whole, so I called for 6 o'clock. Also in that meeting, I'd like to possibly discuss a stray animal ordinance that I've kind of been researching and working on. I've had a lot of emails and calls from residents regarding this. So it's something I've been working with the law department on to see what we can do. So I'd like to possibly add that in if we have some time.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Do you have others?
Yes. Next, I would like to call a law department meeting. A law department, geez, oh Pete. A law committee meeting for the following Tuesday, which would be the 11th, 6 p.m.
Prior to our regular scheduled
Yes, and this would be a discussion to revise the rules of council to include the digital media of our packets that was requested by Mrs. Williams and Mr. Miracle.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Was that it?
One last thing, I would like to ask the Streets Committee Chairman if he would be willing to call a Streets Committee meeting at least within the next month to discuss various items that have been left on the table as well as some newer updates.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Brayton?
I'm sorry, what various items?
Just various items that you wanted, specific items.
Sure.
Update on the 2021 street process or street list, I guess.
Priority list?
Yeah, there you go. Priority list. Just
Street priority list.
Just to see if there's been any updates to it or if it's the same. An update on the street grading system that we're utilizing, where we're at, and what streets have been graded and how they've been graded. An update for the speed humps that we discussed, and possibly a discussion of Park Avenue.
What committee was this and what day again?
I'm not calling it. I requested the chairman to call a meeting within the next month at least.
Okay, and which committee?
The Streets Committee.
Streets, okay.
Streets and Infrastructure.
Okay.
I'm not chairman of it, so.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Do you have your hand up, Mr.
I
Brayton?
did.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I'd like a couple things, please. I want to tout my family. My brother gave me a call, and he works in the Archdiocese building downtown, and he is tasked with drawing the architectural blueprints for the 52 project on playing cards. So I was really excited to know that. My brother Joe Braden, so he's drawing that up. I wanted to mention that in case anybody was interested. Secondly, I wanted to mention something about a solicitor's permit, and it's been bringing my attention that an influx of permits have been issued recently for solicitor's permits. And basically, if you want to go door to door here in Norwood, you have to get a permit and register. You get a number, and then it allows you to go door to door. So I wanted to just mention that to residents because the weather's breaking, and I believe that starting this weekend, there's going to be a whole lot of people going door to door soliciting our residents, and I just wanted to make them aware that if there's any say intimidating tactics, sales tactics, or if someone's rude, or if you're uncomfortable, they must carry that solicitor's permit on them. And if you want to see it, you can ask them to see that permit. And if they're doing something they're not supposed to, you jot that down. You call the police, and that way we know exactly who's causing the issue. So just a public service announcement. A lot of solicitor's permits have been granted in Norwood, and if you are uncomfortable or if someone is using nefarious tactics, don't hesitate to call the police and ask them for their permit number so that you can tell them exactly who that is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. DiNardo.
I have one item. Mr. Tracy, I don't know if this is the right place, but we got a letter about the request for potential ordinance to prohibit residential mosquito spray. Interestingly enough, and I think you know her, on the other side of Ellesmere, a similar and pretty compelling case was made to me. It's tough because I don't really know where I stand because I don't really this is not a world I know much about or use, but I know that there's some pretty strong feelings about the Mosquito Joe type world. Are you comfortable, or I could ask you after if you just want to bring it out later, are you comfortable bringing that and having that discussion in probably the housing?
I will, and that was, I've got it written down on my other sheet of paper. I did want to load up I was going to load up the meeting on the 4th with it, but because we've got the committee of the whole after that, I don't know how much time we're going to need.
It's on your mind.
It's on my agenda. I want to also have the time to research a little bit.
That's great.
Before I come in talking about something I don't know.
You can go ahead and throw it in the committee, that way at least it's in there. We don't necessarily have to get to it, but
right.
If you want to place it in a committee,
that'd be cool.
That way it's in there, whether we get to it, that week or the next meeting or whatever.
I'd like to. Thanks for being open.
I'll officially accept it into the committee.
Thanks. And then my other is really a question, I think, to the law department, but it's really to all of us. So a bit of background on the Norwood Arts Board. After the discussion on murals for most of the summer, it's not really just about murals, but that was a driving force in the creation of the Norwood Arts Board. These people were appointed by the mayor. We all okayed it, and the Norwood Arts Board was made. There was even an ordinance passed. It was kind of pretty brief, but it laid out kind of some of the areas that they're going to be responsible for. So one of the members reached out to me, and we kind of talked about, well, what should we do next? And the next steps that she was asking about was, one, what is the structure, what should be the structure of this board? And two, how should we consider donations, contributions to the board? Okay. I thought about this, and I talked to the law director and the auditor, and they gave really good insight. But essentially, they put it back on the board to say this is a choice. You are part of the city. You're appointed by the mayor, and you do have authority as granted by the ordinance that we all okayed or passed. But at the same time, they will govern themselves around what they're going to be responsible for. And I suppose anything significant we'd have to approve. But I don't know what the money should be. So if someone writes a check for $20 to the Norwood Art Board, one of the things that was a proposed ordinance right here that we tabled was, should we set up a fund? The other option is, should they have kind of like a separate but related 501c3, okay? And so I guess more publicly, I have kind of two questions to you and to us. The first is, do you have any advice, guidance on what makes most sense from the funding side? And then two, knowing that they're a city board appointed by the mayor and approved by us, what should their meetings or communications, how should that be regulated? Presumably similar to us.
That's Mr. Moore?
Yes, please, unless anyone else is comfortable, but I'd prefer if Mr. Moore would start.
Thank you. On the money side, it depends on what they want to do. If the idea is, if people want to make donations just to promote Norwood Arts and maybe build up a fund, then the way to go would be, for lack of anything else, to have a separate fund for that. If you're looking at a larger project, there's a number, we've had when the lenders donate a big chunk of money for a park, that's something the city has to regulate, the city's got to be on top of. For, like the tree board raises, they get some donations, and that runs through the city's financial stuff. If it's, we want to do this event, and somebody wants to donate a bunch of stuff, to do it, but we need it really fast, that becomes more of an issue. If it's a one-off, that may be better handled by, actually the money handled by somebody completely different from the city. Like, we've got volunteers that are going to do whatever this is. And I say that because we have the budget process. And so, okay, somebody's going to give us, we're going to raise, somebody's going to give us $1,000, and then that we're going to order this tomorrow, that's not going to happen. Because unless it's taken care of in the certificate of estimated resources and it's taken care of the appropriations, and for the time being, it's allocated in the fiscal recovery plan, the city can't do it. We can't actually use that money. So it kind of depends on what they want to do. I think there's something to be said for, let's set up the fund just for a bookkeeping thing so that we have that ability when, if somebody comes and says, I want to donate money for the city to buy a plaque over here or to do, whatever that is, that might be a thing to do right now. But really it depends on what they want to do and where they expect the money to come from.
Yep. I have a follow-up because I think it'll drive. The ideal thing in my mind after talking to one particular member would be to have both. And I think that is possible. And both in this case would be to set up a fund to direct traffic or dollars in a general way. But if there were kind of like Friends of Norwood Arts Board 501c3 and their sole purpose of existence was to have special projects or large projects, they could do that too, and the board would direct traffic, I suppose. Is that allowed? Is that muddying things up? I actually think it would drive efficiency because you would choose what makes more sense.
Mr. Moore.
There's a whole lot of red flags with the idea that the Arts Board is directing what the 501c3 does. There probably is a way to do that, but it's one of those things, like it's fine if you have like the athletic boosters. They raise money and they donate uniforms. They raise money and they donate this. They raise money and they donate this. But their decisions are not, their money decisions aren't made by the Board of Education. You see what I'm saying? If there was a separate organization, and it was actually a separate organization, I think there's a way to do that. If it's the idea that the city is setting up its own 501c3, because the purpose of a 501c3 is that you don't pay, is that you can deduct, contributions you make from your income. Well, if you make a donation to the city, you can already deduct that. The city kind of is a charity. If anybody wants to, feel free to write some checks to the city, just for fun. So I just haven't, it asked, that is a complicated question. I don't know the right answer. That's a city auditor and state auditor really expertise kind of thing to look at how to do that. But if there's people that want to set up, I want to support the arts, so I'm going to set up a Norwood Arts Foundation, then there certainly could be, we're going to raise money, we're going to have this event and raise money so that the city, and we're going to donate it to the city. There have been other events like the 5K, the Norwood 5K. That's the kind of thing they do. That's a separate organization, has events, raises money, and they donate stuff to the Norwood parks. So.
And then my last, that was perfect, thank you. I'll relay as much. The last thing is, how did the tree board operate when it was really up and running? Did they have to do everything and only meet in public? How does that?
Mr. Moore.
The Arts Board, the Tree Board, they're public boards. They should meet in public notice, take minutes, all the rest of that stuff. That should be what's done. As far as how it was run, it's too bad Donna's not here because she kind of ran the thing for the longest time, or was at least involved for a very long time.
But I think one thing we can say, if you don't mind, Mr. President, on the tree board, I can just add clarity. So there is a specific fund at the city for the tree board. So there would be donations that would come in from time to time, and then council would have to appropriate the funds. And we could do it proactively if we knew the donations were coming in, expected. But yeah, it was all done through the city. And I would just recommend that we keep it, in my opinion, if you're going to have, unless there's a separate, as Mr. Moore said, a separate board with a separate people, potentially, you could have a crossover of a member, but I would, the board has to be separate for that 501(c)(3) in my opinion, because
that makes it kind of hard.
I would not want, just if you have a city board operating outside of the auditor's office, then there's just a lot of financial controls that aren't there. So, but I do love the fact that we're even having this discussion is awesome, because I think that it's just encouraging to know that the right people were probably appointed to the Arts Board because they're talking about this.
If they're asking. Thank you both for help.
Thank you. Mr. Tracy?
Going back to Mr. DiNardo's question regarding the art board, I was under the impression that the art board was just an advisory committee. Some private citizen company comes to them and says, hey, would this be a great piece or mural or something for this location, and can we put it up there? Not, hey, the art board wants to throw this mural here and this piece of art here and that piece of art there, and we're going to give them money from the city. I wasn't under that impression that this is what was expected, to be honest. And as far as the art board requirements, that's one question I asked in the ordinance was, why weren't there parameters put out for this? You know, as far as how many times they meet, when they meet, you know. It was something that we put in the nuisance ordinance, and we laid out when the appeals board would meet, how long they had to meet, very specific guidelines. And that's something I questioned back when this was going through, and it really, I didn't get an answer for it. So, you know, a lot of these questions that I did ask back when this ordinance came to us seem to be cropping up now. So when a lot of people thought that I was insane for asking these questions, they seem to be coming back to us.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. DiNardo?
Fair point on your second piece. We will all find out what their rhythm would be, because I'll invite them to come tell us. On your first bit around the city giving money for this mural, not that mural. Right now, the fund would be zero. I have no idea what contributions people in our community or outside of it want to give. But it is important to note, particularly if we set up a fund, which is I think what the two of these guys were trying to say when they said it would have a lot of internal control or good controls, is we, the council, even though the mayor appointed them, would still have to approve a lot of those decisions anyway. And I guess that's how the tree board operates too. So it'd be run the same way, that any decision would still have to come through us. And I think on one hand, the arts board or the tree board would say that is good for kind of like consistency and public notice. That's probably bad for being able to do things quickly. I think that we are slow. That can have a lot of benefits to it, but that's one of the things that they were talking about is how do we maximize efficiency and the control. And I think what I'm hearing is unlikely you're going to be able to do that. So let's just set up the fund and run it like the tree board, where all the decisions would have to come to council. There'd be advice, we advise that you should do this, but we'd still have to make that final okay.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Bonds?
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think specifically in this ordinance, it says that like any decision by the art board, I think, is reviewable by council. So
the last full bullet says that, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, I mean, it's still there. And then to Mr. DiNardo's point, I mean, today, you know, when we passed the appropriations ordinance, we were giving permission for basically funds to be spent, you know, in that we were authorizing that it can spend up to this level. So I would just say in the future, if there are concerns, then you would just not authorize it. You'd vote no on that.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Bonds. Any other new business? Mr. Tracy?
Hopefully I'm not taking Mr. Kelch's fire here. I'd like the letter to be sent to the mayor's office in regards to the tree board. I'd like to get that up and going again. And I would like for the mayor's office, because I guess the mayor's office runs the tree board, or I know it's not us, but I would like to recommend that we ask Ms. Dana Bowl to head the tree board up and get that going again.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Kelch?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would definitely love to second Matt on that. I think that's a very good idea. But my question was more or not question, but what I wanted to say here was more of, I would like to refer to the Law and Ordinance Committee, the discussion of diversion programs and community service. I'm not sure exactly what the ordinances we have on now are currently, if we have any at all, but that's a discussion I think we need to have here in the city of Norwood to help people out, to get tickets, fines, stuff like that. Give an opportunity to, clean up our city and maybe catch a break here and there, if need be, where appropriate. So if I could add that to the Law and Ordinance Committee, that'd be excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Kels.
I'm sorry, can you repeat exactly what you were referring to again? Is that?
Discussion on diversion programs and community service programs.
Okay.
Anyone else? Mr. Dracy.
I'll accept that into the committee, and I will actually add it to the, what is that, the May 11th meeting?
Thank you.
And if we could have the law director present as well, so that we can discuss anything that we have on the books regarding a diversion program or what we can do to create one.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's a number of diversion programs run through the county, and the cases that are eligible for that go down there. As far as community service, that's really a question of manpower, and I'm not sure where the police department stands on the people to run community service sentences. So, but I'm happy to come.
So,
thank you, Mr. Moore. Anyone else? Mr. Kelch.
Yeah, if I could, through the chairs, maybe ask Mr. Tracy to see if Chief Kramer can make it so we can kind of address some issues that Mr. Moore kind of brought up about manpower and resources.
Thank you, Mr.
Absolutely,
Kelch.
if we can request Chief Kramer to that meeting as well.
Any other new business? Mr. Bondsman.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I wanted to refer to the Finance Committee, essentially to discuss the plan or to hear from the administration what their plan is for the $3.88 million that we just appropriated for the Norwood Coronavirus Relief Fund. So that essentially is funds for that we got from the American Recovery Rescue Act. They all got the names, but essentially the COVID relief bill that passed a couple of months ago. So I think we could just have discussion on what the ideas or the plans are. I mean, of course, any large expenditure will have to come to council, but I think it'd be good for council at least to have some.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Anyone else, any further new business? Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. So at the last meeting, I referred to the Housing Committee the issue of residential parking or residential permit parking for certain areas of the city. So I was just wanting to ask the chair of the Housing Committee if he plans on having a meeting on that.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Is that you, Mr. Tracy?
Yeah, I'll get it on at least before the end of May.
Thank you, sir. Any further new business? Thank you. Then we'll move on to communications. P1, Auditor Jim Stith regarding the March financial reports. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated April 14th, 2021, to Norwood City Council. Dear council members, this letter is to let you know that the March monthly finance reports were emailed to each council member on April 14th, 2021. If you have not received said email, please let me know so that I can verify your email address and also get you a copy of the reports. Sincerely, Kim Dallas, Account Clerk, Auditor's Office.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Braden.
Motion, letter be received and filed.
Motion by Mr. Braden, receive and file the letter. Mr. Thompson. Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to make a motion to go into executive session to discuss pending litigation before the city, and specifically council's named in it. So I would like to make that motion to go into executive session for that purpose.
Mr. Moore, would you please give us precisely the wording that needs to be said to go into executive session regarding this? request by Mr. Bonsall?
Sure, he pretty much covered it, made a motion to go into executive session to discuss pending litigation.
Do we have to recite the Ohio Revised Code?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Motion by Mr. Bonzel, second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Mr. Tracy?
I'd like to request a 5-minute recess prior to going into this.
Okay, we'll call the roll, and then please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. DeRacy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. We're in executive session.
pleases me, right?
That's why he does it.
I think we're back on.
Right?
Get out of here.
What I just say we're out of executive session? We were out of executive session. Moving on to item R, adjournment. May I have a motion for adjournment? Mr. Bonzel?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Bonzel. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
No.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson? Yes. Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, we have 6 ayes, 1 no. We are adjourned.